Alien princess couldn't speak, but a human understood her pain better than anyone. They told him she was broken, just another mute alien casualty of war. But when he looked into her eyes, he didn't see silence. He saw a story no one else had the patience to hear, and he would risk everything to understand her before the galaxy silenced her forever. The human outpost orbiting the frozen moon of Ferris 4 wasn't a place meant for life. It was a holding cell carved from steel and silence, a forgotten satellite where the air was filtered too thin and the lights flickered like dying stars. Officially it was called Station Arc 7, but those who served here simply called it the grave. It housed prisoners the United Human Alliance didn't want to execute but couldn't release either. Political liabilities, war captives, test subjects, and among them, she was the anomaly. Subject A9. She had arrived weeks earlier in a transport pod with reinforced seals, heavily guarded, her wrists bound in cobalt shackles designed for psionic suppression. They said she was dangerous. They said she was royal. But when Corporal Ethan Vance first saw her through the reinforced observation glass, all he saw was a girl who looked like she hadn't slept in a century. Her skin shimmered faintly beneath the bruises, a luminous lavender hue laced with the subtle iridescence of her Celadran lineage. Her eyes, when open, were silver, hollow, sunken, barely responsive. She didn't speak. Not a word. The military doctor had tried interrogation. The psychologist had tried cognitive triggers. One overzealous general even piped electroshock pulses through her cell interface. But nothing drew a sound, a gesture, or even defiance. She just sat, every day, cross-legged on the freezing metal floor, lips sealed, spine straight, the picture of both nobility and defeat. But Ethan, who had only come to Arc 7 to avoid another deployment on Mars, couldn't help but feel something was wrong. Not with her, he didn't know her, but with the entire premise of her presence. She wasn't violent. She wasn't resistant. She was grieving, the kind of grief so profound it turned language into ashes. He first began slipping food into her cell that wasn't regulation, soft fruit, warm bread instead of the nutrient sludge she was assigned. No one noticed. No one cared. She never acknowledged it. But he saw the faintest movements after his shifts, crumbs gone, bites taken, hands trembling slightly less. It was a language, he realized. A silent one. So he continued. He left a clean towel when she didn't move for 2 days. She used it. He dimmed her light slightly one evening. The next morning, she'd shifted position, curled up instead of hunched. Progress. And then one day he brought her a drawing. Not his own, but something he found discarded in the mess hall. A child's scribble of earth, with a crude heart drawn around it. He placed it under the food tray. She didn't react that day or the next, but on the third day when he checked the tray, he found the picture folded neatly in a square, and in the corner, someone had drawn a perfect rendering of a celadron, blossom, a flower native only to her homeworld. The message was clear. She understood. That changed everything. He began spending more time outside her cell, watching, talking softly even though she never replied. He told her about his sister on Europa, about his mother's cinnamon bread, about how he used to fix hoverbikes as a teenager. Silly things. Human things. And slowly her eyes started to lift when he spoke. She blinked when he laughed. Sometimes she even leaned slightly toward the glass. And then one night, during a power outage that knocked out the temperature regulators, alarms blared and the emergency lights bathed everything in red. Ethan raced to her wing, heart pounding. Her cell's life support had failed. She was huddled, in the corner, body convulsing from the cold. He broke protocol. He opened the door. No one saw. No one would have cared. She was, after all, just a prisoner. But to him, she was no longer Subject A9. She was someone who had answered with art when the world demanded silence. He wrapped her in his jacket, lifted her carefully, and brought her to the decontamination chamber where the backup heat still worked. She didn't resist. She didn't flinch. She just clung to him like a shadow, her fragile frame trembling, not from fear but something older, deeper. He stayed with her until the system rebooted. She didn't sleep, but she didn't move away either. The next day, the guards joked about the blackout. No one asked why Ethan had stayed in Wing D all night. And when he returned her to the cell, her silver eyes met his, fully, truly, for the first time. And she nodded, just once. But it was enough. She knew. He wasn't just a guard. He wasn't just another human in uniform. He had seen her pain and answered not with questions, but with kindness. And in a world where her voice had been stolen, that kindness became a language of its own. He didn't know her name. She still hadn't spoken, but the way she looked at him now, soft, searching, alive, told him everything he needed to know. She remembered who she was, and for the first time since her capture, she believed someone else might remember too. After that night, something changed, not in the rules of Station Arc 7, which remained as rigid and lifeless as the steel hull. It floated in, but in the rhythm between them, between Corporal Ethan Vance and the girl the UHA still insisted on calling Subject A9. Though she still hadn't spoken a word, her silence was no longer void of presence. It had texture now and a pulse, as if her spirit had finally found a tether in the coldness of this place. Ethan began to find excuses to visit more frequently, routine checks, tray replacements, malfunction reports that didn't actually exist. Anything, to stand near her cell and speak into the silence that no longer felt so hollow. He told her about the time he'd snuck into a private observatory back on Earth, just to watch a meteor shower, and got caught by a retired admiral who made him scrub solar panels for a week. He talked about the street market in New Mumbai where spices filled the air like colored smoke and how he'd once dreamt of being an architect instead of a soldier. These weren't stories he told anyone else, not because they were secrets, but because no one ever listened. But she listened. He knew she did. Sometimes she'd blink slowly when he said something particularly meaningful, or tilt her head in that curious way Celadrons did when they wanted someone to go on. And then there were the drawings, her only form of reply. Once he spoke about his father's broken guitar, and the next morning found a sketch of a 6-string instrument lying beneath her pillow, each fret drawn with delicate precision. Another time, he recalled the taste of honeyed toast, and she drew a jar, its lid open, the contents spilling out like liquid amber. They were small exchanges, invisible to the commanders and irrelevant to the war, but to Ethan they were everything. He started leaving her pieces of charcoal hidden inside the meal containers, sometimes tiny notepads torn from his logbook. She never wrote, perhaps couldn't, but the art kept coming and each line felt like a breadcrumb path leading deeper into her soul. But the station wasn't blind forever. One day while Ethan was on a sanitation drill, a new officer arrived. A civilian contractor named Dr. Hayden Merrick, sent by the Central Command's Xenopsychology Division to reassess Celadron detainees. Cold-eyed and clinical, Merrick was everything Ethan despised, a man who saw people as puzzles and emotions as equations. Within hours of arrival, he'd reviewed Subject A9's file and requested an aggressive diagnostic. Ethan protested, loudly. He said she'd been stable, calm, cooperative. Merrick waved him off. "She's not cooperating," he said. "She's dissociating. She needs to be shocked out of it." And so, despite Ethan's formal objection, they strapped her to a neurointerface chair and flooded her with sensory playback. Images of the Celadron homeworld burning, distorted audio of her native tongue, twisted into screams, echoes of military transmissions confirming the death of her kin. Ethan wasn't allowed in the room, but he watched from the surveillance feed, jaw clenched, eyes burning with rage as she flinched and trembled and curled into herself, the pain too loud for even silence to hold. When it was over, they found she'd vomited and collapsed. Still, she did not speak. Dr. Merrick called it a failure of synaptic connectivity. Ethan called it cruelty. He waited until the doctor left that evening, his mind still racing with fury, and then broke into the medbay to retrieve her vitals himself. She had a fever. Her pulse was erratic, her oxygen levels had dropped. But she was still breathing, and when he entered her cell in the middle of the night against every rule he was sworn to uphold, she looked up at him, not with anger or fear, but with tears in her silver eyes. It was the first time he'd seen her cry. And without thinking, he did the one thing no guard was supposed to do. He knelt down beside her, took her fragile hand in his, and whispered his name. "Ethan," he said softly, hoping the syllables would mean something to her. "My name is Ethan." She stared at him, lips trembling, and her fingers twitched around his palm like a pulse waking from stasis. He repeated it again, slower, more tender. "Ethan." And something in her gaze changed, widened, softened, recognized. For a moment he thought she might say it back. Her lips parted, but only a breath came. Still, it was more than anything. He had heard from her since she arrived. He spent the rest of the night there, seated against the cold wall of her cell, hand still cradling hers, whispering stories from Earth and names of constellations he'd memorized as a boy. When dawn broke, he left quietly, returning before the morning shift changed. But when he returned again that afternoon, he found something new waiting for him. A drawing tucked inside the food tray, folded precisely, the paper thinned by hours of handling. On it was a name, not written in letters but illustrated in symbols. A mountain under stars, a spiral of wind. The River Lake glyph Celadrons used for truth. It wasn't English, it wasn't even language in the human sense, but he understood. It was her name. She'd given him her name. It was the highest honor a Celadron could bestow, normally reserved for sacred bonding ceremonies or declarations of alliance. And she had drawn it for him, no one else. He folded it gently, placed it into the lining of his uniform, and promised himself no harm would ever come to her again. But promises were dangerous things in space, because Merrick had been watching, and his next order was far worse than the last. The station lights dimmed as night rotation settled over Arc 7, but for Ethan, there was no rest, no quiet in his thoughts, only the hammering pulse of what he had just seen in the classified transfer. Orders. Subject A9 was scheduled to be moved off station in 72 hours, not for integration, not for release, but to a deep-level research facility colloquially referred to by insiders as the Black Cage, a place rumored to be where the UHA sent those they could not break but refused to kill, where minds were stripped like data logs and memories erased for scientific dissection. And the moment he saw the destination code, something inside him cracked, not in rage but in resolve, because now he understood what Dr. Merrick had been doing all along, baiting the princess into mental instability to justify her removal. And Ethan knew without doubt that if she left Arc 7 she would never be seen again. Not her soul, not her name, not the girl who drew music and starlight from charcoal sticks in silent grief. And as he stared at the transfer command blinking coldly on the screen, his breath hitched in a way it hadn't since the war, since the day he'd watched his unit vaporized by a plasma storm on Kepler, and that old guilt fused into new purpose, because this time he had someone he could still save. And so began the plan. Not a plan really, more like a desperate sketch fueled by adrenaline and sleeplessness, mapped between heartbeats and risks Ethan never would have considered before he met her. But everything about her was a breach of logic, an argument against following orders. And so he spent the next 24 hours watching guard rotations, accessing bypass codes through the station's outdated subgrids, timing the security camera sweeps with the precision of a man who'd memorized every corner of this floating prison. And in the hours before dawn, he sneaked into medbay and pocketed a neural dampener chip and a transdermal cloaking patch designed to scramble biosignatures just long enough to avoid detection, his hands trembling not with fear but urgency, because failure wasn't an option anymore. Failure meant her screams buried in concrete silence, her art dissected like war trophies, and her name, that sacred name, deleted from the galaxy. And so, on the night of her scheduled transfer, while Merrick reviewed final scans and the station powered up the shuttle bay, Ethan made his move, entering her cell for what the logs would show as a final farewell inspection. But as the door slid shut behind him, he whispered, "Tonight?" And her eyes widened, not in panic but recognition, as if she'd known he would come, as if the bond they'd formed needed no further explanation, and with quick, deliberate, Hands, he slipped the dampener onto her spine and activated the patch on her wrist, then guided her to the rear wall where the maintenance duct had long been deactivated for repairs. Repairs Ethan had pretended to file and deliberately delayed for months, and he pried open the panel just wide enough for her to slip through, then followed into the narrow crawl space, steel pressing against their backs and shoulders as they inched through darkness lit only by Ethan's modified torch. Its beam tinted to avoid triggering sensors, and he led her downward past the water reclamation tanks and abandoned fuel corridor, every meter echoing with the threat of discovery, until they reached the disused freight elevator shaft, where Ethan rewired the control pad using salvaged components, each spark a prayer against failure, and when the rusted lift finally groaned to life, it descended like a coffin toward the shuttle bay's lower scaffolding, and it was there, in that twilight silence above the launch pads, that Ethan revealed the final part of the escape. An old courier vessel registered to a deceased transport crewman, a ghost ship hidden behind radiation shields. And as he guided her aboard, his hands still shaking, he explained how he'd preloaded the nav route to a remote border colony outside UHA jurisdiction, a mining outpost with only minimal scans and no Celadrin detection protocols, and though she could not speak, her grip on his hand set enough tighter than it had ever been, trembling but sure. And for a moment, as the engines whirred to life and the launch cradle cracked open, Ethan believed they would make it. Believed. The world beyond this one still had room for mercy and those who chose compassion over command. But the universe, as always, was listening, and moments before launch, the dock sirens screamed, red floodlights pulsing like alarmed hearts, and over the comms came Merrick's voice, clipped and furious. "Unauthorized launch detected, halt that vessel now." And Ethan swore, diving into the pilot's seat and slamming the ignition override, the ship lurching into motion as docking arms snapped free and bulkheads groaned under the pressure of emergency depressurization, and behind them, gun turrets rotated into place, auto-locking on their fleeing ship. But Ethan had anticipated this too, and as they spiraled through the lower gate, he deployed a decoy transpod, its signal identical to their own, and watched it explode in a fiery burst of light that tricked the defense systems into believing their ship had been destroyed. And in the chaos that followed, they drifted into the shadow of ARX-7's debris field, silent, waiting, while Ethan shut down all non-essential systems and whispered for her to stay quiet, though she hadn't made a sound, and she didn't, not a cry, not even a breath louder than the hum of recycled air. And as they floated in the dark, hidden between forgotten hulls and meteor fragments, Ethan reached into his uniform and removed the folded drawing she'd once given him, the name he could not pronounce but now carried like a promise. And when he looked at her, seated across from him in the dim red light of emergency mode, her eyes full of questions and trust, he whispered again, "I won't let them hurt you." And for the first time her hand reached up, not to draw, not to write, but to gently touch his cheek. And in that simple gesture was a galaxy of meaning more than language could hold. And Ethan knew then, without a doubt, that he hadn't just saved her, he'd been saved too. The sun never truly rose on Epsilon Terra. Instead, the skies glowed in a muted hue of amber, as if the planet itself mourned the lives that had been extinguished in its name. In the smuggler's hideout beneath the rusted wreckage of a downed freighter, Eli crouched beside the silent, alien princess. Now no longer just a mission or a burden, but someone who had carved herself wordlessly into the space between his ribs. Nyara sat still, her golden eyes fixed on the faint beam of artificial daylight streaming through a crack above. She hadn't spoken a word because she couldn't. But after the events of the last 3 days, the frantic escape, the sacrifice of the only ally they had in the rebel Dr. Vesh, and the near-miss ambush in the old mining tunnels, Eli didn't need words to know what she felt. Her hand was cold in his, trembling not from fear but exhaustion, grief, and something else that felt like trust. That was what scared Eli the most. He wasn't supposed to be anyone's hope. He was just a disgraced corporal who had turned against his own to help a girl the world saw as subhuman. But looking at her now, her face bruised and blood-stained, her dignity wrapped in tatters, he realized this was no longer about redemption. It was about survival and choice. "We move at dusk," he said, voice low, barely more than breath. Niara nodded once. The movement seemed deliberate, cautious, as though she were committing to it not out of desperation but conviction. They had to reach the drop site, where a black market trader owed Eli a favor from the old war. The man, Freck, was dangerous and slippery, but he had access to off-grid shuttles. It was their only shot at leaving the planet before the Interplanetary Bureau tracked their biosignatures. Still, getting to Freck meant crossing into the urban perimeter of New Carthus, a fortress city now under military lockdown. It was a suicide run. But Eli had come to learn that Niara, mute, hunted, alien, was far from helpless. She understood systems, recognized guard patrol rhythms without needing explanation, and had somehow memorized the encrypted codes Vesh had scrawled in his dying moments. Eli packed the essentials: rations, a compressed thermal tarp, the small decoder Niara had salvaged from a Bureau scout's corpse, and the makeshift voice synthesizer he'd built for her. It wasn't perfect, but it allowed her to string together a few audible words by selecting syllables on a wrist pad. She hadn't used it much. She preferred gestures, glances, touches. But Eli had a feeling she might need it soon. As they moved through the crumbling industrial sector, every corner brought danger. Surveillance drones buzzed overhead, sweeping light across the ground like the eyes of angry gods. Eli led the way, his sidearm gripped low but steady, his heartbeat tracking every shift in shadow. Niara stayed close, barefoot, light on the gravel, her movements like water slipping through cracks. They ducked into a side alley just as a patrol hovered past on magnetic skates. For a moment, Eli thought they were caught. One of the enforcers lingered, scanning the alley with an infrared sweep. Niara pressed herself against the wall behind Eli, one hand resting lightly on his back. It wasn't panic, it was reassurance, as if telling him, "I'm here." When the patrol moved on, Eli exhaled. "We're not going to make it if we don't split the route," he muttered. He looked at Niara. "Can you handle a detour alone?" Her expression hardened, not with fear, but resolve. She tapped the wrist pad. The mechanical voice rasped, "I trust you." Eli's chest tightened. It was the first time she'd used words on him directly. It felt like a covenant. He nodded and handed her the decoder. "You meet me at the warehouse ruins east of the shuttle yard. If I'm not there in 20 minutes, don't wait." She stared at him for a beat too long. He wondered if she would actually go without him. Then she vanished into the shadows, moving like a whisper. Eli turned in the opposite direction, circling toward the checkpoint where he needed to disable the gate control relay. Inside the security outpost, everything reeked of chemical polish and scorched plastic. The tech was newer than he expected. Biometric keypads and rotating sentry drones lined the corridor. He'd need a distraction. He threw a shock pulse grenade down the hall, waited for the alarms to scream, and darted in through the rear exit. Fingers flying across wires and data ports, he cut the gate's central relay. Somewhere, he hoped, Niara now had an open path. But just as he turned to leave, a stun baton cracked across his back. He collapsed with a grunt, and 2 guards seized him, dragging him upright. "You think we don't know what you are," one sneered. "Traitor? Alien lover?" Eli spat blood and grinned through cracked teeth. "I'm not the one afraid of a girl who doesn't even speak." That earned him another blow, but the noise brought something else. The low whine of a pulse rifle charging. The guards froze. Behind them, Niara stood in the hallway, a rifle trembling in her hands. Her face was blank, almost serene. She spoke through the device. "Let him go." Her voice, though robotic, carried weight, power. The guards laughed. "You gonna shoot?" She didn't. She threw the rifle. As it clattered to the floor, both guards instinctively ducked, just long enough for Niara to lunge forward, a blade in her hand, cutting through the nearer man's suit seam. Eli kicked out, slamming the other's head against the wall. Seconds later, it was over. They both stood panting, surrounded by unconscious bodies. "You came back," Eli said hoarsely. Niara simply nodded. "So did you." He helped her, retrieve the rifle. "Come on, No more detours. The rest of the trek to the shuttle yard was blur and blood and silence. They found Freck, greasy, twitchy-eyed, smelling of engine oil and bad liquor, exactly where he said he'd be. "You owe me," Eli said. Freck grinned. "And you brought the alien freak." Touching. Nyara didn't flinch. Eli stepped in, front of her. "We get off this rock, or I sell the Bureau every location you've ever hidden your scum friends." That sobered Freck up. Moments later, they were inside the old transport shuttle. Systems warming. Launch trajectory masked behind. A hacked Bureau distress beacon. As the engines roared and gravity peeled away from their bones, Eli finally let himself breathe. Nyara looked out the viewport, her face bathed in starlight. Her fingers found his again. They didn't need words now. The universe might still hunt them, but together, they had rewritten the ending that had been forced upon them. Not lab rat and jailer, not human and alien. Just two souls, broken by the same war, choosing something better. Choosing freedom.